are the Lit Ladies.
I'm Christy.
I'm Kelly.
And I'm Carissa.
3 writers and moms exploring how to live out our faith in our literary lives.
We span the country from the coast to the Midwest, and with different stages of life, careers, and favorite genres, we're sure to cover the literary landscape.
In every episode, we'll discuss books we love, reading life, and writing craft, using the Bible as our guide for beauty, goodness, and truth. New episodes drop every other Friday.
Hello and welcome to the Lit Ladies podcast. Today we are thrilled to have a guest, author Tess Bentley. Tess writes historical fiction with a touch of speculation and the Gothic. So I feel like, Tess, we have so many interests in common, a love of classic Gothic literature and the Bronte sisters and women's issues, especially historical. So I'm really excited to pick your brain today on all of these topics. A little bit more about Tess. She has loved books, their scent, their feel, and the world held within their pages since she was a young child. That love of reading was vital in her development as a woman and a mother. After spending 10 years working as a registered nurse, Tess found herself in extremis and returned to her first means of escapism, books. Tess has since written her first novel, Veil, and has recently received her MA in English with a specialization in Gothic studies with distinction. Women's issues, now and historically, hold a tender place in Tess's heart. Tess lives with her family in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas with their cat, Patch, who was rescued. Tess, just tell us a little bit more about yourself and your writing journey. Maybe your pivot to scholarship is really interesting, and how did all that come about?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So where do you live in California?
I live, I don't know if you've heard, I'm in Tulare County.
Okay.
So where are you at?
So I'm in Santa Maria, which is an hour north of Santa Barbara. So I'm on the Central Coast.
Oh, you're on the Central Coast. Okay, lucky you.
I know.
So I'm in the Central Valley, which is a little more painful, especially in the summer. I mean, it's a small town, and everybody does know everybody, but I'm so introverted.
And small towns are good. And actually, reading Veil, I picked up on a lot of the California references. It was fun to know. I mean, our climate's a little different on the coast, but I've spent enough time in the valley to, I don't know the smells and the sights and the trees. And
yes. Well, I'm glad you said that. Well, that was an ode towards, because, I mean, I'm an Anglophile. I love everything about England. I love Victorian literature, British literature. I'm better at it than American literature, which is, I know, a shame. I'm not completely ignorant of American literature, but it definitely it's a weaker subject for me. But when I started Veil, I wanted her to be a modern woman to begin with, and I thought, why not the Central Valley? Because I was immediately, my thought went to where else could I put her from? Yeah. And I do think that is in Central California, especially, we are overlooked quite a bit. I mean, we're competing with San Francisco and Los Angeles. So,
sure.
So I was like, I'm going to put her there. And then the cemetery I talk about in the first chapter, that is our local cemetery. And we do have I looked everything up. I made sure we had the trees. It was spring. So it was easy to incorporate that. So I'm glad you noticed that. Because it's an ode to people that know this area.
Yeah. And one of the things about California, I did not grow up here, but I lived in Orange County for a long time. I feel like there's a whole state and people assume you're either from San Francisco or you're from LA. And there's this whole rest of the state. And honestly, our town is nothing like LA. It's nothing like Orange County. Yeah. We're a bunch of kind of, I want to say down to earth, lots of agriculture, and that's probably how it is in the Valley. So there's just so much to California that doesn't really get portrayed very often.
Since we're talking about Veil, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your writing journey, Tess, and how you pivoted into scholarship and just how you came to write Veil?
So I first fell in love with Victorian literature. So I have to start here. I fell in love with Victorian literature when I read Jane Eyre. And I was 22 when I picked up the book. And afterwards, it just stayed in my head for years, these characters. And I was actually an English major at the time. And I was, applying to different schools and stuff. But I did have this pressure on the other side from my mom, go into nursing, be an RN. And so I went to talk to my school counselor. And I had just watched The Lord of the Rings. So I was absolutely obsessed with high fantasy, um, specifically The Lord of the Rings, though. And was starting to write my own, you know how it is, you're inspired. And I was young, so I'm trying to write my own novel. I'm even making the maps with the little mountains and, so
Of course,
I'm mimicking.
it's like a rite of passage for fantasy writing.
Yes, and I'm parroting, Tolkien. I'm parroting what I've seen at the time. And so I go to talk to my counselor, and I'm like, I'm really torn, though I love writing. I want to be an English major. I love everything about the language, but, I can see myself as a nurse too. And, I know it's more stable. So I kept kind of being pulled towards stability. And he asked me about my book. He's like, well, go ahead and tell me about it. And so I told him, I said, well, my protagonist, her name is Saren. Well, I took it from the name Sarah and tried to make it different, right? I'm not saying I wasn't a Charlotte Bronte. I wasn't a genius at a young age. Let me just make that clear. And he goes, did you know sarin is a poisonous gas? Okay. No, I didn't. And immediately,
I have heard that name before in your defense.
Thank you. But, just my personality, I was like, oh my God, I'm not smart enough. I immediately just felt it. I'm like, I'm not smart enough for what I would want to do with my writing. And so I left that meeting, and he didn't mean to, kind of, rain on my parade or anything. He was just trying to guide me, I think. And he encouraged me to do the writing, just in his defense. That was kind of how that conversation ended. And so, but I decided at that point, you know what, I'm going to kind of stick to the academic part. I'll put writing away for now as far as really trying to write a full novel. I think at that point I was more having play time anyhow than really trying to sit down and write a book. And so I went into the more academic part of it. And anyways, fast forward 10 years later, I became an RN. So just to, get that out there for your listeners. And I don't want to say it was the wrong choice. You shouldn't have any regret. And I did learn a lot. And I'm going to tell you, there's things about humanity that I learned that not a lot of careers can teach you, that nursing can teach you, especially with death and dying, And so, so I don't have any regrets. I do think it shaped me, but I left a yearning in me that wasn't satisfied. And in that meantime, I got married. I had 4 boys, so I had a few other things come up, and I started to feel depressed. So around 2020, a little bit of depression set in for me. And the way I describe it to like friends I've talked to about it is, I just had many different rivers. There was different reasons to kind of have some sadness, and they flowed in like one body of water. Like they all met at the ocean, and there I was kind of drowning in it. Oh. And so towards the end of the year, I decided to go back for a master's in English. I'm like, I got to do something. And so during that time, though, I had these characters that I had been inspired to have in my head after reading Jane Eyre. They were in my mind, and I kept having. And I risk, sounding crazy saying all this, but I'm just going to be honest. I think I was having maybe a little bit of maladaptive daydreaming. I'm not sure. I had a lot of fantasies in my head, though, and they were. It was so nice to be lost in my mind. And I am a thinker. I am very introverted. Since I was a kid, anything I watched, the Three Musketeers, the Never-Ending Story, it just sets my imagination on fire. But I didn't really have anybody in my family to guide me that maybe that was a creative in the works the whole time. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So I'm being pushed towards stability when all this time I probably should have been writing. And I did write little poems here and there. I'm not a poet. I will never share it, but there are some in existence. Little mini stories, a lot of stories for my kids. But as I started right when I started my degree, I did start to feel better. And I felt myself coming out of that depression. But I didn't want to let go of the stories I'd created in my head. And I was almost sad to say goodbye to them. I thought, I'm like, did you have a breakdown? But I was very stable. I went to work. My life kept going on. My kids were fine. So outwardly, you would never know all this was going on. And so I started, I thought, I'll just write them out. I'll just write a couple things out so I have it, just to remind myself down the road that I have these stories. 7 chapters, I realized, oh my God, I'm writing a book. And it's about that time, I really felt the depression just lift. And I'm like, oh my gosh, a year ago, not even a year ago, 6 months ago, I was in this deep depression that scared me. It really did. I'd never been that. I'm not really someone that gets depressed, so I didn't know what to do with that. I was ashamed of it. And then, fast forward 6 months, I'm doing the degree I wish I'd have done to begin with. And I'm doing it in Gothic literature, which was even, more exciting for me. And I'm writing a novel. So by August 2021, I had written the whole story. So yeah,
Wow.
So I know, I'm sorry, I can't be concise with that story because it was just so much happened for Vel to be created.
That's amazing. It's like your mind
you.
needs, when you're even dealing with just sadness and life stuff, your mind just needs that escape or like stimulation,
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you found something that you love. So you majored or specialized in the Gothic. So can you explain or define that for our listeners, which I know is not an easy task?
It's not, but I will do my best with it. So, the Gothic movement started with the Castle of Otranto back in, I don't have my dates in front of me, so, anybody out there that's like an expert listening, forgive me.
Like 1700s?
Yes, about 1750.
I know the century. Yeah.
Yes. So I think it was around like 1746, 1750, somewhere in there is the Castle of Otranto. And it ran to about Frankenstein with Mary Shelley. So in Britain, that was the Gothic movement in literature. In the US, it went to Edgar Allan Poe in the 1830s. So it went just about a decade longer. And so, when you read Gothic stories, what sort of defines it is, and let me see, I did think about this a little bit. You have your darker themes. So a lot of times you're going to see oppression, othering, isolation. So you're going to deal with, like I said, darker themes, darker characterization, with your protagonists, your villains. You have the atmosphere. So that's another thing that defines the Gothic is it's moody. Or it doesn't even have to be moody. You could make something Gothic because there's too much heat, too much sun. So, that's where, an author can be very creative with that. And then you have like your setting. So typically what you're going to see with the Gothic is it is set in another country normally. So when you had your British writers, most of their stories took place in Italy, France, Spain. And so...
that's right. Yeah, Frankenstein. Elsewhere.
Yeah, so most of the time, and that kind of deals with the othering. And so in the early Gothic literature, one thing that was very prominent was you would see they're usually Catholic. And so you would see the patriarchy, you would see a lot of misogyny, how women were treated, and how the church was used against them. And that was a statement by the authors, who were British and Protestant. So that's, something that kind of defines the Gothic. Of course, we still have Gothic literature, and you see that by the motifs, the tropes and stuff, but you do need, usually it's a female protagonist, but it doesn't have to be, but there is usually a family member or somebody out there that is causing them some sort of oppression. I'm sure people can argue different things now, but that's your typical Gothic literature. When you read it, you usually get a feeling of uncanny, or it could be dread. It's some sort of strong emotion. It doesn't have to end on a bad note. It depends who you read. Your first two people in Gothic literature that really made a name for it was Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Monk Lewis. And Radcliffe, she started what we call the School of Terror. So it was frightening. It made you uncomfortable. But her stories usually resolve with it not being supernatural. And supernatural is part of the Gothic. It can be. The Castle of Otranto was absolutely supernatural. So it can have a ghost. You can also show it wasn't really a ghost. But Monk Lewis, so that was his nickname, his started the School of Horror. And I think most of the time now when people think of the Gothic, they think of Gothic horror, but which is not my favorite. But I do like the more classical Gothic tropes and stuff. So.
Which would be like terror. It's kind of like that dread building. But not necessarily something like horrific or grotesque, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if you guys have read The Monk, but it's...
I've heard of it.
It's probably may not want to.
But I like horror, so would I like it? Yeah, we actually talked about this distinction in our horror episode, so that's why I bring it up. I think Christy and I are kind of both. We'll do both, right?
Yeah. I don't want gory, but I don't mind like creepy. I don't mind supernatural. Like I like all those elements.
Yeah, I don't love anything. I just people getting something chopped off, all that. That's just not my favorite.
Yeah, I'm not really into gore.
No, it's the gore, and I would say there's very little gore. I mean, he gets his in the end. So I actually do not make a nod to the monk in Vel. So towards the end, she talks about Ambrosio.
Don't ruin it for me yet, because I'm like halfway through.
Okay, I won't say anything. It's a little bit of foreshadowing, though, for those that have read it. And I didn't expect most people to read it. I didn't. It is a little bit of an Easter egg, I suppose. But if you have, or if somebody looked it up, it would probably come up pretty easily that he's not a good guy. So it is foreshadowing in the novel. But yeah, in the monk, it's more... just to give you a quick synopsis, he is favored, everybody loves him, and his ego grows immensely. And he's tempted by this woman, and she looks like the Madonna. And he doesn't know. Do you guys want me just to spoil it for you? I mean, I don't think you're going to pick it up.
The monk you can,
it's the devil the whole time. And he basically pulls him into debauchery and reprobation towards the end. So, yeah, it's a pretty intense novel. I had to read it for school. I don't know if I'd have picked it up on my own. It's not written beautifully. It does have a neat story within a story, inset story they call it, and it was Raymond and I can't remember the girl's name that he falls in love with. That is a neat story. It's a little bit of romance in it that you get, and they used to make plays out of it because people preferred that part of the monk than his bigger arc of the story. So a little bit of literature there for you.
Thanks for defining Gothic for us. I think it's interesting because maybe we can talk about it now or later. I think I have a question about it, just about how it's different today, because I feel like sometimes today we would think of Gothic and we'd think, well, it has to have a big house and it has to have a singular brooding male figure who might be bad, might be good. It has to have a ghost, but so I think are more external things that we usually think to define Gothic, whereas I like the more thematic, subtle qualifications you gave. I think that's really interesting.
So I have a question then. Would Vale be considered Gothic? Like, would you have had Gothic elements in Vale?
Yeah, I think it absolutely fits the Gothic genre, in the classical sense. Mm-hmm. She's othered. I mean, she's an American in England. Okay. So there's already an othering there, and it's kind of a reverse, way of doing it. But there is a, chapter where they even tell her, we wouldn't brag about our American cousins, and I mean, and maybe a lot of people might say, oh, that's not real, I don't know. I think as Americans, you do feel a little sense of being isolated from the rest of the world because, I mean, we're so huge. Traveling's not as easy for us as our European friends. And it takes a lot more planning on our part because, it's hard to do. So there's just little things that come up. So I did incorporate that in Vel. There is having the male figure, right, that sort of oppresses. But it's just not as quite as... I don't want to ruin anything, so I have to be careful here. But you do have John Emberley in the beginning who forces her. She's got a bad husband. Mm-hmm. So, and I do kind of leave that, and we could talk about that in a minute, but I kind of leave that aside. But, she has these men in her life that have forced a decision for her in some ways. And then there is a threat in Vel, and there is a scene, I don't know how far in you are, but there is a scene that was very Gothic. So I don't want to blow it for you, but she's a little bit of abuse that happens towards the middle of the book, I think it is.
Okay, I was like, I'm at the gypsies now, but that's not giving a thing. So I'm like right before middle way, maybe.
So Edward's taken her to see them?
Yes.
Okay, so you're not there yet, but
yeah, I know it's about to go.
Yeah. So there's something, and it is definitely. So all I'll tell you is the idea of a convent comes up. So it's definitely a nod because they would historically force them into convents that they wouldn't marry who they wanted them to marry. Wow. Or, that is part of the original Gothic. So yeah, I would say it's Gothic in those elements. You have Avonhurst, which is the large house. It in of itself, is that an oppressive factor? I don't think so. But that's so much of a house, so depends on the person's mentality. So that's kind of with the Gothic. For her, the whole country is kind of oppressive in a way because it's not hers. She's uncomfortable. But so yeah, I didn't set out to write a Gothic novel. It's just as I was studying it and writing it, I'm like, oh, there's so many parallels. And honestly, I think that's easy to do because the Gothic really is telling the truth of humanity.
Yes.
I mean, shoot, Britney Spears' story. When I heard that, I thought that's a Gothic story if I've ever heard one. She's locked up in a house, being forced to do things, So I do think when it touches on how women are treated, it's a trope that will come up quite a bit, So.
Okay, I have a question. You guys do not have to answer this because it's not even pre-planned, but now I'm just curious. So if Gothic literature is more of the feelings and showing humanity, what was before that? Like, what was literature like before the Gothic phase?
There weren't a lot of novels before that, really, were there?
Jane
Austen's credited as one of the first novelists, and she's in the early 1800s.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I mean, in my opinion, she's not the first novelist. You had Samuel Richardson come before her. She had quite a few people that inspired her to write. But I actually listened to a course on the history of the novel. And so there is kind of arguments at what time it actually started. When they say like a romance, they didn't actually mean it in the sense that we call a romance. It meant like a story. So yeah, it's a little confusing. But I think they touched on stuff like that, but I think the earlier novels actually had more to do with like brotherhood and being feudal and stories of grandeur. And I don't know how often they actually touched on, and even like the early Gothic wasn't, I wouldn't say it was very emotional, but it did sort of, like the Castle of Otranto deals with, she's supposed to get married, there's a family curse, and the curse is a big part of the Gothic, which by the way Vel has, so that's also a qualifier, but you see the curses. So I think it's evolved over time. So it's I think the biggest key of the Gothic early, at least, was the feeling of uncanny, sublime, dread. But those are human qualities, those are human feelings, So it like I said, it's a long conversation to have with how the Gothic developed, because you're looking at how it came out of Romanticism in the late 18th century, But yeah, I think when we get towards the 19th century, that's when you really start, I think, pulling. Well, I take that back. Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, and it's a very long novel, but it is an emotional story. There's more telling than showing, I'm going to tell you. But you do see in that novel a young woman who's being totally oppressed by her family, forced into a marriage, and the fallout, what it does to her psyche, the torment that happens to her. So I think towards the late 18th century, you see more of that come out in literature, at least in England, that I know of. I could. The French
I know. It's like I really only know like English literature, obviously.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about Vale. So I'm going to give like a one sentence summary, so you can tell me if you would have a different summary. So I found it, I mean, just kind of by chance or not by chance, on a book sale, and the cover immediately caught my eye. It just looks so different and professional. It's got this like beautiful black background and kind of a gold like swirly thing, and it's got these two figures, silhouettes on the front. And then I knew just like immediately this novel is definitely for me. I was like, definitely buy. So it's about a woman who gets transported back into the Victorian era, but as her 18-year-old self. And she has to figure out how to break this curse and get back to her children in her own time. But along the way, a surprising love blossoms. And there's really just so many lovely allusions in it to Jane Eyre and Charlotte Bronte. And reading it, I just knew this author is a true Victorianist. And I hope to get to meet her someday. So I'm like super excited.
Thank you.
Even just like the writing style, I felt like, this just reminds me of reading Jane Eyre. I love it.
Thank you. That's the biggest compliment. I mean, it makes me smile ear to ear. I love that. Thank you. It wasn't intentional either. So it truly is a compliment, because I wasn't, throwing it out there like, hey, this is written, Bronte style. But yeah, I appreciate
I think it just happens when we love something and we study it.
Absolutely.
So we talked a little bit about how it came about kind of from Jane Eyre in a way. What other elements, or were there some other elements that were inspired by your studies, or did you just kind of like soak it up and it kind of Vale is what came out? Were you like, thinking about some of these other works you were studying?
I mean, I would say, yeah, I was inspired by Jane Eyre. I think it's also, it's escapism. I think that's really where it was born from, was, you know how it is. You read something, and that's why people love fantasy, because you're escaping, and you're like, if I was, would I want to be an elf, or would I want to be a dwarf, or Frodo? Do I want to be a hobbit? Like, no matter what you're reading, like, I mean, maybe not everybody does that. Maybe I'm just silly. I don't know. But when I read Jane Eyre, I was always obsessed with the Victorian era. Let me just say that too. My grandmother decorated her whole house Victorian style, and she was born in the 30s. I was raised by my grandmother. And so and she definitely treated me like a girly girl. I had my little brush in the mirror. And my friend was just teasing me the other day. We went to an antique shop, and I was like, I just love all of this. And she's like, I never really thought about it. You're kind of raised like a Victorian. So no wonder you're obsessed. And I'm like, I think being surrounded by it, there's that, like, it's familiar in a weird way. And I used that in the book. But so I think that escapism, like I said, I had been depressed, and just imagine, like, was life simpler then? And that was a naive, probably, thought process at the time, because I don't think it was. I think it's nuanced, right? Some things were simpler, of course, but not everything. And there was, obviously dealing with death and stuff was very different. You were more likely to deal with it, at an earlier time in your life too, for the majority of people, not just for the unfortunate, in our time. So anyways, I had this, like, escapism. What would it be like to live then? And I think I just kind of lived in that time for a little bit. And it makes sense now why I was personally escaping with my thoughts. But when I started writing it, then the story kind of took on its own life. It wasn't just, because not all of it was in my mind, but the characters were. So I guess that's what I should say. The characters were there. I've renamed a couple of them. But they were there, and it just kind of grew. And so as I was writing it, and I had to think, like, why would somebody go back in time? Like, the time machine's been done, I was like, what else? What if she was supposed to be born in that time? What if that's why all these Victorian things are familiar? What if that's why she always felt out of place, like a fish out of water? And so, yeah, just from there, it was born, and it took on a life of itself. It's hard to explain. It is hard to explain, like, how the writing process works,
I think that's so relatable. Just feeling like, I think a lot of people, I feel like sometimes I feel like I'm born in the wrong time, just kind of like a longing, but I think for everybody, actually, a longing for another world, a longing for a different time.
Yeah, I absolutely think so.
And I was just going to say, I think there is a little bit of this unknown way of explaining what happens when you write. And I've heard other writers say this too, where you may not even know what the characters are going to say or how they're going to come out, but you start writing and it just kind of comes out. It happens to me often where I kind of know generally where I'm going, and then all of a sudden it just keeps coming. And I know it's
character
the same
just appears.
For these other two. They just appear. You're like, I didn't plan that character coming, but here this character is. So it's a very weird, I don't want to say out of body experience, but in some ways it almost feels out of body, like, when magical. You really are in that rhythm.
It really is.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think
you just agree.
Yeah, it's the imagination. And I also wanted to say, I really loved in Vale the kind of analysis of the like what was simpler and what was more complicated. Like there was a part she's like, there were no street lights, there were no cars, there was no noise. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine what it would be like to have all of that stripped away. Quiet. But then I think in another part, she was like, well, it's not like we could take a car there to get there fast, so we had to take a horse. So it was just interesting looking at these comparisons and also thinking, oh, in some ways life would have been simpler, and in some ways it would have been a lot harder and a lot more complicated. So I enjoyed that part of it.
I also loved the details about like her toilette and what she did to bathe, and I just think that's so interesting because they skip over that in so many historical novels, and I was like, oh, this is so realistic. Like, it's not always the way we imagine it to be,
Well, when I was thinking about it, I was like, what if you really went back in time? Because everybody's like, when you get reviews and stuff, people have their opinion. Like, I would act this way. I would never let a man tell me what to do. I promise you, if you went back to the 19th century suddenly, yeah, you will. you
be
know,
convent or you follow directions.
yeah,
Right?
you're going to be working, harder than you ever worked in your life. You may just not eat. So yeah, there's a lot, the society, the rules were different. So I'm like, you would comply to some extent, so I had to consider that. And I considered like the bathroom, and I might have at first when I was writing it been a little too technical because I'm like, I'm gonna tell you though, and I love Outlander. I love it. So I'm not speaking ill of Outlander at all. However, as I'm reading it, I'm like, when's she gonna go pee? Like that because that would be a big deal for us, right? Like, and for Vel, she wouldn't even say bathroom. Where's the bathroom? They don't call it that in England. I had a hard time asking when I actually went to England because they'll just say toilet. And I'm like, toilet, that's
You don't say the loo. I thought they always said loo.
And I probably could have, if when you look instead of saying like restrooms, it just says toilets. And so for Vel, though, I'm like, how would you? So that's where I was like, I don't want it to be all the novel, but I definitely want to, show like what would be complicated for us. Wearing dresses, that's a lot of material that, would be heavy. So yeah, I try to incorporate it without being too technical. So I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about the faith elements in Vale? Just like your thought process behind your character's faith journey. I know Charlotte Bronte, her faith is a big part of her life, and you see that in Jane Eyre, just in the kind of woven into the story.
Jane Eyre, I mean, it's all over there. I actually, you're asking about my academic. I don't think I answered you properly, but I have submitted a journal article that actually discusses Charlotte Bronte's personal relationship with Christ within Jane Eyre. So, wish me luck. It's in peer review right now. So that's, I think, more terrifying than querying, honestly. But yeah, with Vel, though, so there's the escapism, right? We talked about that. But the quote that kept coming to me was, "For the former things are passed away." And what's that mean when you're going through something? It's really recognizing that you're going to get to the other side of something, right? I mean, literally in the Bible, it's talking about a new heaven, new earth, all that, the new Jerusalem. But for myself in the situation I was in, I was like, someday I won't be suffering. I won't be struggling with these sorrows that I have. So I used that in the beginning of Vel. And I think it was just sort of a guiding point. And so I don't know that it wasn't I don't want to say it wasn't without intention, but it wasn't intentional either. It was just natural to kind of interweave her faith. And I'm sure because it is for me. And I wasn't trying to sell anybody anything. It really wasn't agenda driven or any of that. It's just natural to the character. And so I wanted to show authentically. And so, sorry, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question properly here.
I figured you'd know more also about Charlotte Bronte's own faith. She was the daughter of a clergyman. And I think it was pretty much everybody was culturally Christian at that time, but whether people had a true saving faith in Christ, and I believe she did. I mean, from what I've read, so
I absolutely believe she did. And you're right. Culturally, it was acceptable. That kind of set the grounds for propriety. And so many novels are kind of these days are about how they break that, and sometimes absurdly, but it's fun. It's fun to write that, like Bridgerton and all these other things. It's fun to break those molds and stuff. But Charlotte Bronte, she really was in a predicament spiritually for a time. So I do believe, and this is what my article talks about too. But if you just pick up any biography on her, they'll talk about it. She did have a strong faith in God, but she was a woman writing in a male world, and she was told by I cannot think of his name. I didn't think it would come up, but I can't think of the author that she had written to. I think maybe it was a poet.
William Thackeray? Was it William Thackeray?
It wasn't Thackeray.
I know she loves him. Okay,
she does love Thackeray. She does, to her detriment, really. But so I want to say like Southey or something like that was the name. I'm ashamed of myself right now. I should know that. But he basically told her, it's not a women's place to write. And some people really were like, that was terrible of him, yada, yada, yada. He was also a man of his time. And I do think,
exactly.
Yeah, and I do think that he was also saying, like, a woman, when you have children, you have a family, it's going to be exceedingly difficult, and you're going to drive yourself crazy trying to balance both. And unfortunately, that's
Preach.
still very relatable.
Kind of right.
Yeah, raise your hand. It is. I mean, you have to have determination to be a woman writer, a female writer. I'm not saying men don't either. I'm not picking on men. It's just very different. I mean, it just is. I'm not recovered from my 4 times during childbirth. I don't care how many years it's been, you know. I don't know that you ever recover totally, you know. But essentially, though, he told her that, and she took that, just like me and Saren. You know, I'm like, I'm done. She was done for a while too, and she was going to open a school, and her and Emily went to Brussels, and they learned, you know, French, and then Charlotte was by herself, and so anyways, she had it in her head for a little bit that it's not her place to write, and is that what God wants for her? Fortunately, she was a very independent-minded, fiery spirit, and she did decide God would not have given me this gift if he didn't intend for me to use it. And boy, did she use it. So, yeah, and that's why when you read Jane Eyre, and that's exactly what my article talks about, is depending what lens you use, people argue back then it's too feminist, and it was ungodly. Nowadays, it's not feminist enough, and it's too godly. You know, she's in a fortunate position her whole life, and her legacy. You can't please everybody, but I think she was just very independent. You know, in her feelings, she had a personal relationship with Christ, and she saw that men were fallible. You know, they make mistakes. Whether you're a priest, a pastor, anybody, you know, it's all up to interpretation. Plus, she was exposed to a lot of religions because, like you said, her father was a curate for the Anglican Church. Her mother was Methodist. They had the evangelical movement happening at that time. She was terrified of the thought of Calvinism, that you're predestined for heaven or hell. So she was like, she had bad thoughts, naughty thoughts sometimes. I'm sure she was just having, you know, you go through adolescence, you have romantic thoughts. Sometimes they're not exactly pure thoughts. So I think that she thought she must be one of the damned. And so she did struggle with religion for a time. But yeah, I definitely think that she was a strong Christian woman, and it does show throughout Jane Eyre. I mean, Jane flees from temptation, you know, and there's so many allusions. There's so much scripture in Jane Eyre. I couldn't even use it all. It's just amazing to me how much she included in the story, you know, even between, have you all read Jane Eyre? I'm not sure if
It's been many years.
Okay. It's okay. You probably remember St. John. So, although in my head it was St. John for a long time.
Right?
It's pronounced. Yeah. I think a lot of us did not know that, but yes, St. John. You know, I compared him and Mr. Rochester, and Mr. Rochester is one of the lost sheep. He's the one that Christ goes and looks for. You know, it says you'll leave the 99 and look for that one lost lamb, and that's him, where St. John's more the straight and narrow. And I really do feel like Charlotte Bronte in those characters shows that you are to be redeemed. If you choose to turn back to Christ, you will be redeemed. So yeah, there's so much in Jane Eyre that is religious. If you only ever watched the movies, you'd probably be shocked when you read the novel. But it's also, she does it so well, so interwoven, that you may not realize it's one of the central themes of the book.
Yeah. Okay, since you mentioned movies, do you have a preference for which film? You've seen is it the 2011 version with I can't pronounce her name, Mia something?
Well, I know it's
like that's the most recent one.
Michael something Fassbender. Oh my gosh,
Michael Fassbender. Michael Fassbender.
Fassbender. Right? There you go. Thank you. Yeah, I think that one was done beautifully, cinematography wise. I will tell you, I would not recommend it to someone. Yeah, it was gorgeous. They did it so well. I do think they gave credit to the time period, all that. However, I would not recommend it to somebody that's never read the book, because even I was like, I wouldn't want to be with Mr. Rochester if he was like that. Yeah, I really wouldn't. So I prefer the miniseries, the 2006 with Toby Stephens and Ruth Wilson. Yeah, that's my favorite.
I'm thinking of the same one. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he just did Mr. Rochester so well. I mean, he's a great actor. She was a wonderful Jane. And they didn't focus in on the religious elements, and they didn't even stick to the script, you know, Charlotte's writing perfectly. But they pulled a theme out of it, being passion, othering, I would say, because they did do well with Bertha Mason in it. And so that's kind of what, to me, from my perspective, what they led with, and I think they did a brilliant job because there are so many different themes, different angles you could do Jane Eyre, and I didn't really feel any of them really strongly in the 2011 version. It just that it was beautiful. I did think that. I thought it is pleasant to look at. But the relationship between Jane and Rochester seems so contentious, and the way he treated her with Ingram, Miss Ingram, where in the 2006 version with her, there's a scene with just Mr. Rochester and Miss Ingram, and it's not in the book, but they put it in there, I think, to show that he's not interested in her. He was irritated by her. So they added it for the context of the viewer. The reader already kind of has a feeling because Jane tells you, he made fun of her though. So like his personality came out, So anyways, yeah, I definitely prefer the 2006.
I'm like, I haven't seen any one.
We'll start with that one. You start with that one then.
Start with that one. Yeah. As I was telling Carissa when I was reading over the questions for this interview, I was like, clearly I'm going to have to go read some classics to keep up with you. So, because we all have our different areas that I read everything. Carissa's more classical. And then Kelly, what do we call you? Like romantic suspense, rom-com?
Really?
More contemporary.
know what we call me. I could
call you contemporary because you don't really read historical, do you?
I do actually like some historical. Yeah, I've read. I haven't read it.
I haven't read it in a while. But I do read some. I was going to say, like I said, I'm still reading Vale, but so I'm in the part before midway, and so she's still dealing with like, a lot of depression, and it's like it's lasting. And I think that's something you don't see in books much anymore. Yeah. Like it feels like someone dies, and it's like next day it's back to normal. Yeah. Like let's go kill someone, let's go do this or that, whatever. And I'm like. Yeah, and it's just like nice to be like, oh, this is how it really feels. Like you do deal with this day after day. You do have trouble, getting out of bed. And I was going to say too, last podcast that we had, we talked to Rochelle Nelson, and she mentioned that she had also dealt with anxiety through writing. And I was like, I love that people are finding ways, because Kelly and I have discussed this too. So Kelly came at it from a point where she had anxiety, like the spiraling thoughts, and then she turned it into writing. Whereas I come from, I've always been, the spiraling thoughts have always been fiction until like my 40s, and then life hit me a little harder. And so now I have to remind myself, like, let's stop spiraling about reality and let's start spiraling about fiction, because that's obviously way more fun and healthy. Yeah. But I just like that it's coming out in like the creative ways, I guess.
I think it's almost like a question of what came first, the chicken or the egg. Like... And people say, like, how come writers are always depressed? Writers are always this. And, you have other people say, that's not true. That's not true. But I think to some extent it is, but because mental illness isn't necessarily chronic for everybody, but it's acute for everyone, so like, here's my nursing coming out. Acute usually lasts no more than 3 months, and anything longer than that could be a chronic illness, and so some people are going to have depression that is hard to get rid of, or anxiety, but for others, it could be situational. And even just a situational depression, you're going through a rough patch in your marriage, or it's the end, you suddenly, they just leave you. I mean, that's very traumatic for some people, and that might be the event that inspires you to write. Now, it's great if something creative comes out of it. That's not always the case. Some people may glow up. They call it glowing up now, by starting a business or maybe reconnecting. So it doesn't have to be creative. But if you are a creative, I think that is when you're going to maybe connect with it. And some people, they tap into that at early age, or they try to. I tried. Like I said, I wasn't ready. And I am glad I waited, because I'm going to tell you, that would have been a stupid book. It really would have.
Because no one should publish their first book ever. I mean. Like with the one you write in middle school.
Exactly.
But I was going to say, I think creatives, we spend more time in our heads. So it's fair that like we would examine more thoughts more closely, I guess, and kind of fixate on them, because that's kind of what we do.
I always think about it like your greatest strength can be your greatest weakness. And so, oftentimes people who struggle in these areas, they might be more sensitive. They might be more empathetic. They might be more imaginative. And sometimes that can feel like it gets the best of you and it can be overwhelming. And other times you can take that sensitivity or that empathy or that creativity and channel that towards something else, whether that's relationally or writing or, you know, painting or crocheting or whatever that, you know, outlet might be. So I think, you know, I don't know. I think the Lord, it's like that thorn in the flesh, I guess. Like Paul had prayed so long to have something taken away. And at some point God said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. And I think that's like what we would all hopefully do, right? Like we have this weakness that we can let God get the glory through as we use it to honor him, if that makes sense.
Well, I think creativity is a gift from God too. Like how blessed are we that we have that he gives that to us. He creates beauty, and then he asks us, as Tolkien says, to be sub-creators and play with what he made and give us something good.
You know, it's so interesting, Carissa, that you said that, because I started listening to a podcast. My mom suggested to me, she's like, start your day each day with the Bible. So in Genesis, the one thing he was talking about was what makes the creation story so unique in the Judeo, you know, realm is that it is a creation. Most stories, creative, you know, creation myths, whatever you want to call them, begin with violence or lust. You're born from something like that. It's a big bang. It's a boom. It's, you know, even in different mythologies, the gods are trying to play with humans. There's just a lot of different ways to go about it. But our creation story is created, you know, out of love, for the purpose of love, for one, makes it unique, but it is a creation. And he says this is why humans want to create, because we are made in his image. So it is the most natural thing in the world to want to create. And I just listened to him say that, so I think you're so spot on about it. And I do think, though, that's where it kind of connects with anxiety, depression, all these other things. If you are called for it and you're not doing it, yeah, you're probably going to have a hard time. And I do think, like when I was talking earlier, that was part of my issue. Even though nursing did me well, it was a great career, and and there's so many wonderful nurses out in the world, so it has nothing to do with the field. It just wasn't really what I should have been doing. And I mean, if you just knew the anxiety I had over the years, I was sick to my stomach every day going into work, because it just, I mean, I was, you know, for reference, I was a labor and delivery nurse starting off, and that is one of the most stressful fields to go into.
Oh,
so it probably was not the right one for me. But, you know, when I started writing, I stopped biting my nails. Just so I actually have like a outward, how would you say that? Like I don't know. I'm not even sure what I'm trying to say. Yeah, something, you know, of how it can heal anxiety. So yeah, I think if you are called for it and you're not doing it, there is going to be some suffering. And I mean, not just in the creatives. If you feel that you're called for something, you know, you should at least, if it can't be your main job, you still need to pay attention to that part of you.
Yep.
And I do think if you feel you are called to write or paint or art, there's going to be different levels of how good you are at it. You know, there are going to be people that are just, they're genius. And there are going to be people that are okay, you know, but you still need to be doing
harder.
So, yes. And Stephen King says it in his memoir, you know, his like writing memoir. He's like, there are some people that are just awful. He goes, I have to say it. It's true. He's like, there's some people that cannot write. He goes, should you still write? Yes. If you feel the calling, you still need to do it. But yeah, you know, be realistic with yourself. Don't, you know, it's like American Idol, right? You got people that love to sing. Are they all going to be Kelly Clarkson or Carrie Underwood? No. And some of them, you know, they were, I feel, exploited a little bit with their singing on stage. You know, they were the fun ones to watch, of course. So it got them ratings. But yeah, you know, some people are called. But if you have it, you need to tap into that to some degree, because I do think it's going to bother you. You'll have regret, or, you know, give you anxiety, at least.
Well, I keep thinking about, I was just reading about Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I mean, she's American and in a different era, but just how she dealt with what sounds like, from our perspective, like manic, I think she's manic depressive, and how she just had to deal with that. And these doctors were telling her the rest cure was so popular at the time. Like, just sit and do nothing. Actually, lay in bed for 6 weeks and don't even go to the bathroom. We'll just empty your bowels for you. And like, can you think of anything more awful for someone who wants to write? And I can't even imagine. But she felt like once she started doing those things, she felt better.
Yeah.
Anyways, just fascinating. I was just reading about that.
It is. It's all fascinating, yeah, with the history of medicine and all. It's all related. It's all relative, but yeah.
Okay. So jumping back to Vale, and I really like the topic, by the way, just on a side note, I really like when we get to dive into some of the why behind writing. So I appreciate you being willing to meander down that road with us, Tess.
No,
but I do want to know, I am a newbie to fantasy, and I'm learning so much from Carissa, my resident expert. So I'm just going to be 100% honest. I really liked Vale because it was more historical fiction than fantasy. So that's like very appealing to me. But how would Vale differ from fantasy or magical realism? Like, where do you differentiate those?
Well, if I mess up, Chris, I'll just let you jump in and correct me. Okay.
I know people define it differently than me.
They do. And so I should, probably start there and preface it with, there is arguments constantly on the internet, even with agents. This actually, the genre blending that I did makes it very hard to query. And it drives me crazy because 150 years ago, they didn't deal with genre, so you just wrote your novel. If it was good, it was good. And, but I get it for marketing purposes. You have to kind of pick a lane. And I have paid the price by picking the wrong lane a time or two when it comes to marketing. But that's a whole different story, And I think, if you're romance, you better get it right if you're going to advertise as romance, or your reviewers are going to not like you. But I would say with fantasy, usually high fantasy, or you have world building. So, and there are, like I said, you could define it differently, but I think of world building, magical realism. So I know it's set in like our world. So it's the regular world, whichever, country, doesn't matter, but it's in the regular world. I do think it started in South America, but the magic's accepted. The magic just exists as part of their world. So Vale, I wouldn't say it's magical realism because they know the magic is weird. They know that it's not normally that way. So, and the realism is that it's part of it. So with Phil,
there's not always. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think in magical realism, there's not always an explanation of like where this magic came from, or this whole magic system where people learn how to wield it. Because you can't have grounded fantasy or contemporary fantasy. Like, what's the first series that comes to my mind? I'm trying to think. City of Bones. Mortal Instruments. Like that's all in our world. But there's so many. Like there's magic systems and world building and rules. So,
yeah, see, and it's why it's hard to define because, I would think, because I did read the first few books. Yep, I'm glad you said those ones because haven't read a lot of fantasy, but that just so happens to be the ones I have read. It was weird for her at first, though, right? Like the Shadow Hunters and all that, and then she finds out this whole other world, and then it exists. And Harry Potter's kind of the same way, but some people do put Harry Potter under magical realism because it's accepted in their world. So that's hard to say because there's a lot of world building with both of them. But I do know that I'm trying to think of is it Beloved or where it's just part realism. Where it's just solitude. Yes. So I think of them when I think of magical realism. Vale is just a little bit of fantasy. So I wasn't doing high fantasy. It was more to move the plot and to begin the story than to really be the whole story.
Okay.
And even with my book, I'm going to put out on submission or querying soon. It has some time travel elements to it too, but it is more to engage the plot. It's not the whole story. It's addressed, there's a little bit of folklore behind it, but yeah. So I think I like to do just a little bit of fantasy edge. So I guess it could clearly fall into historical fantasy.
Okay, historical fantasy. And what do you label it when you're querying?
It's historical fiction. The bigger genre would be historical fiction. Within historical fiction, you do have, the time periods, but fantasy is one of them.
Okay.
So if I was going to be specific, it would be, fantasy. But it's hard because, it has Gothic elements. It's got different. Yeah. So it's kind of, it's hard to genre blend, but
it's a nice gateway book. I call those like gateway books into the fantasy genre for people who don't normally read fantasy and don't want to have to keep track of a lot of names. I think it works well as that.
Yeah. They're all fun. They're all fun to read and write.
They are. So when you're writing, thanks. Do you consider yourself more of a plotter, a pantser? Are you like in between the plantser world?
I think I'm more in the plants world for sure. I have a idea. I have a loose idea of what I'm going to write, but before I can actually begin, I have to know the denouement, the ending. I need to know how it's going to end. What am I working towards? I never leave that open. So, but I will have and I'll think out like what would I like to happen. So, like with the one that I'm in a query, the long case clock, I knew she was going to go between two time periods, but not constantly. Or even with Vel, I knew Vel wasn't going to go back. And that was one thing I knew was going to be different than a lot of people for time travel is they kind of go around in time. I wasn't going to let her go home. So I knew that from the beginning, So I'll have an idea and I'll have a couple plot points, but for the most part, I'm pantsing. Dialogue, all that. Now, unfortunately, I'll be driving when, a brilliant line comes into my mind. Always. I don't know. It's just because I think we're relaxed, or whenever you're just relaxed, and when you're driving, though, you got this big machine you're having to guide, so you can't just write it down. But I have been known to pull over. One time I had Post-its and I just put them all down my arm. So I wrote out a scene with Post-its. My phone, my notes on my iPhone, it takes up a lot of my storage, So if I have something, or even just maybe a scene, because music really seems to set off my imagination. So when I'm in the car and I have my annoying music going, my poor children, I'll just, sometimes they'll come up. And so that's part of, I guess, the pantsing. I consider that part of the creative process. But dialogue. So I may have something to kind of go back to because it's come up during my day. But yeah, for the most part, I have an idea, but I'm not real strict with it. And I am willing to change. I know I've heard some plotters, they're like, I decided how this book's going to go, and that's that. No way. I couldn't even, I would, with that much pressure, I would fail from the beginning. I have to be kind of open and be okay to change. Flexible. And I'll be flexible. Just trust that, the story's you're going to write it. It's there. Just let it happen. I don't even put a time limit on myself. I know some people are like 3 months. I'm like, God, as long as you want me to take,
it? Oh my gosh.
Oh yeah. I mean, I've just seen different, personalities online and stuff, and they're like, I give myself a month, or I give myself 6 months, maybe a year. If I put that pressure on it, it's no longer going to be fun for me. But that's just that's, how I deal with stress and stuff. If I put any kind of, I don't know, what am I trying to say? If I just try to force myself to do anything, I feel like I'm just setting myself up for failure.
Is it? Yeah. Carissa, what's like a good writing day for you? How many words? Because I think you said before you're a slow writer. You said that, right?
I haven't been drafting in a while. If I do like 1,000 words in a day, that's like amazing.
Okay.
Yeah. It's usually, actually for a while, I think my goal was like about 500 words, and that's actually was pretty good between like little writing sessions all stitched together.
Yeah, you get 500. Okay.
I felt slow, but
I mean, that's probably about my pacing, honestly. I did 1,900 a couple days ago, and I was like, pat on the back. I'm like, good girl, that surprised me. But I hadn't written in a few days, so I was just more motivated. I don't know. But yeah, if I could even, some days I'm like, just get on there, stare at your work. If you are having a bad day and you just need to touch base with it. It's like your homework, right? Some people get their homework done the night before, and some people pace themselves great. For me, if I had to write an essay, I just need to at least look at it some days so I feel connected to it. Because when you don't feel connected to it, that's when that fear builds of, oh, I'm not going to finish this manuscript. I'm not going to do this. So I at least touch base with my novel, listen to a song that reminds me of it, something. But I feel like I'm a slower writer because I'm writing historical fiction. I mean, like we're talking about genre. At the end of the day, I am writing historical fiction, and that requires a lot more research, at least for me. I'm not an expert on everything. I have to refresh my memory, and a couple years makes a big difference on what they might have even called something back then. And I had that come up with Vel with bobbies and pillars for the police. So luckily I had my editor was from the Historical Novel Association, or Society, and I had put Scotland Yard to begin with. And she's like, Scotland Yard comes in the 1860s. You're in 1847. Wow. And so I went back to my Victorian books over there, and I saw where they were using. I looked up as pillar. At the time, it was still Robert Pillar was the one that created it. So they started off calling them pillars, and then that went into bobbies later, and they still call them bobbies today.
Wow.
Yeah, sorry. There's another little
Good for
bonus
your-
nugget you didn't
No,
need
I
to know.
love
But
that.
Well, it's probably bad when I look at board usage. I'm like, I can fudge it by a year or two. That works. My project is historical right now. It's definitely a different beast, that's for sure. There's a lot that takes longer.
yeah, so don't give yourself a hard time. It's hard. I mean, sometimes, yeah, if you're, in a scene that has nothing to do with any historical elements, yeah, you can. I'm trying to write about drinking. I'm like, it's hard to use words about alcohol. They didn't say alcoholic. So I'm like, how many times can you dance around the word alcoholic without using it, So, and stay true to their language. It's not, I mean, it's fun if you like to do it, but I can see why others wouldn't want to do it.
Yeah.
That's challenging.
sure.
Yeah, that's for sure challenging.
So you mentioned your other project, the long case clock. So is that what's next for you?
It is. So, well, I'm querying that one now. And then I am going to write I am currently writing the prequel to Vel, which is called Emberly. So that is what I'm currently working on. So William, who is, sort of I don't know if you want to call him villain. I don't know if he is the villain, but he doesn't come off too great in the story. It's his story. So, and I'll leave it up to the reader to decide if they redeem him or not. But yeah, so that's what I'm working on. Yeah. So
Awesome.
hopefully
We're
we'll see
excited.
that one next year, maybe.
Excited to see where that goes. We'll link all of Tess Bentley's information and socials in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such a fun conversation to nerd out with someone.
No, yeah.
Thank
it's
you.
fine. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on our literary journey. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Lit Ladies Pod and rate and review on your podcast platform. Today we'll end with a quote from Charlotte Bronte herself. But this I know, the writer who possesses the creative gift owns something of which he is not always master.